Okay, so this lecture we are going to be starting the nervous system. There are 4 parts to this chapter in the book. It's so important that we understand the nervous system because we're going to be using it for things like treating injuries and traumas and how disease processes work, how we're going to treat it with medication and therapies, mechanical ventilation. So it's very important we understand this. I don't want you to get overwhelmed because it can be very confusing. So we're going to take it in little chunks. I'm going to try to explain everything thoroughly. If you have any questions while you're listening to the recording, write them down, and we'll start the beginning of class on Monday with a question session. Maybe start thinking of ideas of how we can incorporate games or something into this part of our studies. So let's go ahead and get started. So the nervous system is about communication. I've mentioned it talking about the skeletal system and the muscular system, that our brain has to communicate with our body so that we can move, so we can naturally protect ourselves with things like running away from danger or something's too hot or too cold, and to protect our body physically, but also it's going to help us maintain homeostasis. It is what helps us keep the heart beating, an autonomic function such as breathing. So we're going to maintain homeostasis in the environment inside the body as well as the environment outside the body. So overall, think of the nervous system as the communication center for the body. Communication center. And that is going to help us maintain homeostasis. Okay, so some terms that you need to know and understand is the central nervous system, which is composed of the brain and the spinal cord. So this is where all communication is going to start. And then we have the peripheral nervous system. So sometimes central nervous system is called the CNS, and the peripheral nervous system is the PNS. So this is going to be the network of nerves that go out to the body. Oops, network of nerves. And it's like the middleman that goes from the center of the hub of communication out to the body, to the tissues to get that reaction that we want. So this is going to send messages to and from the central processing center, which brings us to our next term, which would be sensory neurons, which equals afferent or afferent, however you want to remember this. So sensory neurons are afferent messages that are going to be incoming to the brain. So these arrive at the brain. So we'll use the example of stepping on a sharp Lego in the middle of the night when it's dark. So you step on that Lego, it's dark, you don't see it, it hurts. So your foot is going to sense that it's in pain and send those message up to the brain and the spinal cord, and that is going to give us a reaction. And then we have motor neurons, and these are efferent or efferent because they exit the brain. And this message is going to your foot, and it's saying, okay, dummy, move your foot off of the Lego because it hurts, okay? So afferent, arrive or incoming, and efferent exit, they're outgoing. Okay, now some of these efferent exiting messages can be in different neurons and have different responses. So our first one would be soma, motor. And soma is body and motor is movement. So these are going to go to the skeletal and muscular systems. So MM is muscular and skeletal systems. And this is going to tell us to move. Okay. And then other messages are autonomic. And you've heard that word before. And this is going to go to our heart, glands, and other hollow organs, like our lungs. Because that's something that we automatically are doing. So somomotor is voluntary, autonomic is not voluntary. We don't have to sit there and consciously think, okay, heart, beat, beat, beat. So these are autonomic functions. And then the autonomic nervous system, the ANS, is divided into parasympathetic and sympathetic. And we're going to talk some more about that. So now that we've got some basic terms out of the way, what does our nervous system do for us? Communication, right? It's going to process, like I said, process the environment outside of the body and inside of the body. We can communicate with other humans. We can interact with animals. So that's one function. Motor control, protecting our body. Sensation, we feel hot, we feel cold, we feel pain, things feel good, things are stimulating us. So our major organs that we're going to talk about, again, are the brain, the spinal cord, and our nerves. So repetition is a great way to study and a great way to understand specifically what we're talking about. So what I want you to know here is it maintains homeostasis. So our control system is maintaining homeostasis. It's going to monitor both inside and outside the body and the environment. So neurons consume 25% of your daily caloric intake. That's a huge chunk, right? It's our nervous system is never stopping working. It works 24 hours a day. It never shuts down. Some people's nervous system overworks. It works too much. And think of anxiety, depression, different kind of neurological disorders, seizures. If you have a seizure, your body is and your neurological system is going to misfire and overfire, and it's going to be exhausting and tiring. I personally think that being mentally tired can take a toll on you more than physically tired. I used to be a competitive swimmer, so I'd swim and I'd swim and I'd swim and I'd have swim meets for weekends at a time. And then I was a dancer, so dancing and just go, 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 go. But when I would be studying, and if I was studying really hard and I was really focused on something, I would feel more physically tired because now your calories are not just, that 25% are going to your nervous system all the time, but now you've increased how much you're using your nervous system. So these first couple weeks of school, getting back into school, and if you're still working and you're just exhausted, you're training your body to do something new. So know that it does take a lot of energy to run your nervous system. Okay, so we've talked a little bit about terminology, so let's try and put this diagram together in another way that will help you understand it. So up here we have the overall nervous system. So this is everything put together. And then from there, we're divided into two systems. The central nervous system, which is just the brain and spinal cord, which is this picture here. And then the peripheral nervous system, which are all the nerves and pathways that the brain and spinal cord send those messages to the tissues for reaction. So the peripheral nervous system is kind of like the middleman. And then peripheral nervous system is divided into those two pathways we talked about. We have somatic, which is voluntary and skeletal muscles, and then autonomic, which is talking to our glands and our organs and smooth muscles. So something we do every day. So this is going to be constant. And this one is going to be voluntary. Sorry. Okay. And from the autonomic nervous system, so constant, we have sympathetic and parasympathetic. And those are our two functions we can switch in and out of. So sympathetic is going to be fight or flight. And parasympathetic is going to be rest and digest. And we will talk about that some more. And then on the other side of things, on the voluntary, we have the sensory afferent. Remember, afferent arrives to the brain. So that is the message going to the brain saying we stepped on that really sharp, painful Lego. And the motor is our exit, our efferent, exiting the brain to respond to that afferensory signal. Okay, so breaking it down again, something new, if you know that you're back to school, it's been a while. If we repeat something over and over again, you probably need to know it and understand it. And we don't always just mean to repeat it because we like to repeat things, but seeing something in a different format or writing it in notes in a different way or hearing it explained differently is going to help you remember it. And it may click a couple times after you hear it, or the way I explain something versus the way Derek explains something may help you as well. So again, two main divisions, central, peripheral. So know what each is composed of and what their function is. In the future, when we start talking about things like nerve blocking agents or drugs that we use as paralytics for intubation, it's going to be important to understand how this system works so we can block something or that we can enhance something with a drug. And that's all we're going to talk about for now because we're not quite there yet. Okay, so the brain is where it all starts. It's a central processing center. It's going to control us. It's going to control our emotions as well. It's something that's fascinating, and it's not fully understand how the brain works. There's still so much more to discover, and not even just how a normal functioning brain works, but how different disease processes and disorders can change the brain, how we can treat that with chemicals and neurotransmitters. It's very fascinating, but let's just start with the anatomy of the brain first. So it has four subdivisions. We have the cerebrum, which is composed of the frontal, temporal, parietal, and occipital lobes, and the insula. So know what lobes are in each part of the brain and the subdivisions. And then we have the diencephalon that has the hypothalamus and the thalamus. We get into talking about endocrinology, and we'll talk about how hormones are released, and this part of the brain is helpful for that system because it's going to initiate chemical reactions in the body, like stress and then cortisol, and we'll get into that later in this class. But temperature is also regulated in this part of the brain as well. And then we have the brainstem, the medulla oblongata, the pons, the midbrain, and reticular formation. So this is going to tell us when and how big of breaths to take. So we have the brainstem here, the cerebrum here, and the cerebellum back here, which we will get to. Okay, so here is a closer picture of the four subdivisions. The cerebrum, which another easy way to think of it is it's that wrinkly part of your brain, right? That looks like a walnut. It's this part here, and then you have the diencephalon, which is in the middle, surrounded by the cerebrum. The brainstem comes out here. The hypothalamus and thalamus are going to be there. And then the cerebellum comes down here out the back. Okay, so just another picture highlighting the peripheral nervous system. We're carrying messages in two directions, right? We have to have a reaction, we have to get that message to the brain so that the brain can say, okay, well, this is what I think you need to do. And then the brain sends that message back. So you could see where there could be a problem with message carrying. So let's start with sensory nerves. So afferent, incoming, arriving. I'll write that again. So these are arriving to the brain. And then we have motor neurons, which are efferent, which means they are exiting the brain. Okay. So when something happens, again, we'll use the same example. We'll use the Lego. And that little stinker's here. And you step on it, and it's going to send sensation to the foot, right? And then the foot is going to take that sensation and take it along this line to the brain via the spinal cord. Okay, so the spinal cord is in here inside this vertebrae, and then it's going to travel up to the brain. The brain is then going to decide what to do. It's reaction. How should we react? It's going to send the message of, okay, well, let's not step on it anymore, back to the spinal cord. The spinal cord is then going to have that message and take it to the nerve that's going to go back to the muscle, and then that signal is sent so that we no longer step on that Lego. It is important to know that efferent messages are not always going to travel to a muscle. Efferents may also travel to autonomic. So autonomic or somomotor. So voluntary or autonomic, an automatic function, automatic reaction. Okay, so know the difference between somomotor nervous system and autonomic. So skeletal muscles for soma. I like to think of soma muscle relaxers because they make your muscles relax. That's how I remember that they're for skeletal muscles. And then autonomic is going to be, they're going to stimulate glands, cardiac muscle, heart, smooth muscle, blood vessels, because our blood vessels can contract and dilate, and also our bronchial smooth muscles in our lungs that contract and relax and can cause bronchoconstriction. So this is going to be important to know the difference between the two. So make sure that you know this. So let's talk specifically about the autonomic nervous system and the parasympathetic and sympathetic nervous system. So know these two. So the parasympathetic nervous system, I said, is rest and digest. So this is our body's natural reaction to what is going on in the outside environment. When we have a parasympathetic response, electrical messages are carried out to our body autonomically. So our heart rate, let's write this out. So we are going to have a decreased heart rate, decreased respiratory rate, digestion, defecation, and urination are happening because we're not having to run away from something. We're not having to fight something. We're not anxious. So, well, we could, anyway. So we're resting when we're sitting at home and we are watching TV and we're relaxing, or we're on vacation and we're laying on the beach and there's no worries in the world. We're going to be in a parasympathetic nervous system. Now, the opposite of that is going to be sympathetic nervous system. This is our fight or flight. This is going to tell our body something is going on in the outside world that is not okay, and it's going to increase our heart rate. It's going to increase our respiratory, it's going to increase our respiratory rate, increase our blood pressure. It's our fight or flight. We can live without a sympathetic nervous system. We cannot live without our parasympathetic nervous system, okay? Because of digestion, defecation, and urination. So we cannot live without this one. Okay, so know the difference between the two. We use this to stimulate responses with drugs. The parasympathetic nervous system, we're not having to take as big of breaths, right? Because we don't need that oxygen levels to be as high. So when we increase things in physical activity and our sympathetic nervous system is in action, we have increased heart rate, increased respiratory rate, our body's preparing for something, our oxygen needs go up. We need to have more blood flow to our vital organs. So therefore, everything in our lungs is going to relax so that we can take those big deep breaths. Now, in the parasympathetic nervous system, we're going to have bronchoconstriction because we have no care in the world, so we don't have to have big breaths. So here, I want you to know that bronchial smooth muscle relaxes, and here we have bronchoconstriction. And that is going to come in handy when we get to pharmacology next semester. So again, know these terms. Afferent, messages to CNS, they arrive. Efferent, messages go away from the CNS, so they exit. Okay, so now let's talk about the anatomy of the nervous system. Now that we have the organization down and what its function is, so neurons, which are nerve cells, our neuroglia cells are make up the nervous system. They can be very long. You can have a nerve that goes from the tip of your finger all the way to the spinal cord. So it's going to depend on which nervous system, autonomic nervous system it's a part of and where in the body it is. So there's three main parts. So know each part and what its main function is. So your dendrite receives information. A neuron can have anywhere from 1 to 1,000 dendrites, and it is going to be this little guy here that kind of comes off the side. So there can be one or there can be many. They're going to continue to branch. You see it's bigger up towards the cell and it continues to branch off so that we can have these sensory messages income to the cell. Then we have the cell body, and that's that bigger part here that's going to contain all the organelles and the nucleus that keeps that running. Also in this portion of the cell is where the neurotransmitter is going to be housed. So we talked about acetylcholine a little bit on Wednesday. So acetylcholine was the neurotransmitter that is required to make skeletal muscles react. So we'll say if this was a cell going to a skeletal muscle, our acetylcholine would be in the body of the cell as well. And then we have the axon, and the axon is going to carry outgoing messages. So this guy here is going to take the message back to, we'll say, the skeletal muscle. And these are those synaptic knobs that we were talking about, where the neurotransmitter is released. Okay, let's talk more about the dendrite. So remember, receives information. Receives information. These little guys here continue to branch. We can have 1 to 1,000. So this is where we get that sensory. So incoming message is going to go to the body of the nerve. And the nucleus is there so that we can process and send the message to the rest of the central nervous system. So I just said the body contains the nucleus and all the organelles. It also houses the neurotransmitter because neurotransmitters need protein. And protein synthesis is going to happen in the body of the neuron, so that it can release the vesicles down the axon, which we will talk about next, so that we can secrete the neurotransmitters in those secretory vessels. So secretory vessels will start in the body, and then once we need a reaction, then it'll start to travel. Okay, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second. So talking about neurotransmitters, this is where we may have a problem with decreased or increased amount of neurotransmitters that can cause specific disorders. So like depression can be caused by an increase or decrease of certain neurotransmitters. It can be a chemical reaction. So there are neurological disorders. So these cells are being studied so that we can treat these disease processes. Okay, let's talk about the axon. So it leaves the neuron body at the axon hillux, or the trigger zone. And so it's an electrical message that's going to travel away from the body of the neuron. So it's going from up here, if this were the body, down the axon. And then it's going to reach the end that has the branches. It's called the terminal arborization. And arbor means tree, so it looks like a tree. And so know that that's the end, and that's where we're going to release our reaction. So whatever type of cell that this neuron's at, whether it be skeletal muscle or gland, it's going to release the neurotransmitter that's going to tell that cell how to react. So if we are moving our leg off of that Lego, it's going to go to the skeletal muscle, and that skeletal muscle is going to take in the neurotransmitter, and then it's going to say, ooh, I need to contract. So our muscles are going to contract. Okay, the blue here, you can see, that is our myelin sheath. So myelin sheath is going to cover and protect the nerve itself, the axon of the nerve. And it's going to cover only the axon. It doesn't cover the body or the dendrites. It's going to help insulate it because it's lipid rich. You can see that it only intermittently covers it, right? There's little gaps in it, and those are called the nodes of Ranvier, sorry. And they're important for conduction. So we said electricity is going to send this signal. So myelin sheath is going to help aid in that conductivity so that it goes from one to a next. It's going to play leapfrog across the myelin sheath and help with the conductivity of that axon. So something to know is myelin sheath is white, the color white. So it's also called white matter. If you've heard the term gray matter, that is our brain and spinal cord. So let's sum this all up. So we have our dendrites, which is going to be incoming messages that branch out in our sensory. Then we have, here, let's mark it. So dendrites are here, sensory, incoming. And then we have the body, and that's going to process the message. And then we have the axon here, and that is going to send message to the tissues. There are three types of neuron: unipolar, bipolar, and multipolar, which are named for the direction that the messages are sent, their anatomy, their location, and the type of messages. Unipolar neurons have one process and one dendrite. You can see the cell body and the dendrite are opposite ends. They're only sensory. They're only for sensory. So they're only going to carry afferent signals to the CNS. They only carry afferent signals to the CNS. They're found on the skin, some organs. So it's important to know that they're afferent. They are bind together, and they are, or I should say grouped together would be a better word. They're grouped together and they form what's called a ganglia. And a ganglia is how these nerve cells transport the message to the spinal cord. But we will talk about that later. So know that they group together and form a ganglia. Bipolar have one dendrite and one axon. Having two processes can be uncommon. Can be found in our navel cavities, our retina, our inner ear, and they're responsible for sight, taste, sound, and smell. So again, these are sensory neurons, and by doing this, they're protecting us from what we hear, what we taste, what we smell, all of that. I have to say, whenever I think of the nervous system and I teach about it, I always think about that movie Inside Out on from Disney. So maybe we can figure out a way to incorporate that into the rest of the nervous system lectures. These cells, since they're sensory, are also going to be afferent. So they take messages to the brain to have a reaction. So multipolar neurons are the big boys. So they are going to have multiple dendrites and the axon, so three or more processes, and they're bigger. They're located in the central nervous system in the brain and spinal cord, so they have the important job of receiving and sending messages, and same with the peripheral nervous system. This is going to be important for reacting to these messages, and the autonomic nervous system to make sure that our body is doing its continuous functions. So in the brain and spinal cord, these multipolar neurons can both send and receive message, so afferent and efferent. If they are in the somatic nervous system, they are only efferent, right? Because the bipolar and unipolar are the afferent, and the multipolar are going to be the efferent. So the anatomy of the neuroglia. So these are not neurons. These are neuroglia, and they are also cells that help make up the nervous system that aid the neuron itself in its functions. It's called nerve glue. So this is going to help group these nerves together or neurons and create those ganglia. So nerve glue. So let's talk about the six. So here we have the oligodendrocyte, and this is what's going to form the myelin in the CNS. So the bottom of this little piece here is very lipid rich, and that's going to help protect and provide conductivity to the axon. So this is going to create that myelin sheath. So epididymal cells are going to be found in fluid-filled cavities and spaces of the central nervous system, and that is responsible for producing cerebral spinal fluid, or CSF. You can see that there are cilia on these cells, and that's going to help circulate that fluid so it doesn't stay stagnant and move it throughout the spinal cavity and between the skull and the brain. Okay, so astrocytes are very important. They are the most numerous. They are going to be what attaches the nervous system to blood supply. I said earlier that 25% of your caloric intake is taken up by the nervous system. So it's constantly running. So how are we going to get nutrients to and from the nervous system? It is these guys right here. So this is what's going to form the blood-brain barrier. So you might also see it as BBB, blood-brain barrier. And not everything can cross the blood-brain barrier. It's important to understand what this is, what can and cannot cross it, and we're going to talk about that more soon. So it's going to protect us as well. It's like the gatekeeper of what can cross the BBB. Astrocytes are also responsible for checking the cerebral spinal fluid, making sure that it's clean, monitoring it for any bad guys, so infections. Okay, it also will fill the damaged areas where we have nerve damage in our brain or our central nervous system. Okay, microglia are our defense system for the CNS. It's a macrophage, and that means that it's going to eat up waste and toxins. So it is responsible for keeping everything clean and getting rid of them. I like to think of them as little Pac-Mans, and they're just going to emulsify toxins and waste that are not supposed to be there and get rid of it. Okay, so the Schwann cell forms a piece of the myelin sheath. And you are probably thinking, well, didn't we just learn about one? So unlike the oligodendrocytes, it's a mouthful, the oligodendrocytes will wrap around the axon more than one time, whereas the Schwann cells is going to only wrap around once. So this is going to be the base layer. It is only going to wrap around once. So it still has a lipid-rich content, but only that one time we need that other cell to create the insulation. Schwann cells will also help axons regenerate if they're severed, or if there is a disruption in the axon. Especially in the parasympathetic nervous system, it will help regrow, and it'll take a couple weeks to do that, depending how bad the injury to that cell is. Okay. And then satellite cells will regulate chemical environment of neurons in the parasympathetic nervous system. So make sure that you know all of these cells and how and where they're found and what their job is.